Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about chapters 2, 3, and 5 from the Business and Professional Communication textbook. Our focus of these first 3 weeks of class has really been on chapter 1 and chapter 4. And while there are some important concepts in chapters 2, 3, and 5, I think they are rather self explanatory. I think a lot of it is a recap from information that you should have learned in interpersonal communication, which is the prerequisite for this class. And a lot of it is very easy to understand if you take the time to read each of these chapters. So while this is not an exhaustive snapshot of each of these chapters, I wanted to take a few minutes for each chapter and highlight some of the most important information, some of the information that I think will be actually useful to you both today and in your future career in the workplace, and quite frankly, also shed some light on some material that might be emphasized on your midterm exam. And while you're responsible for all the material in each of these chapters, I want to focus on those elements. And so, chapter 2 covers primarily the difference between verbal and nonverbal communication, in particular, a wide range of differences between the two, and goes to great lengths to define a lot of things, to define nonverbal communication, and to point out a lot of different things about it. One of the most interesting and I think important things to remember when you're dealing with nonverbal communication, which is obviously all the ways that we communicate without words. That includes our gestures, our body language, how we utter our words, our physical appearance, our use of facial expressions, our use of space. And one of the most important things, like I was saying, about nonverbal communication is that most scholars tend to agree that when it comes to the total meaning of our communication, the total meaning of what we're saying, the nonverbal system accounts for somewhere between about 65 to up to 93% of our total meaning of communication. And I think we spend so much time in and out of the classroom focusing on verbal communication and written communication that we forget that a lot of times it's our body language, our gestures, our tone of voice, our facial expression, how close or distant we are from someone, and even our overall physical appearance in a certain environment that's going to really affect what we're saying more than the actual words that we choose to use. You know, your book talks about um, four main purposes of nonverbal communication, that it is to express emotion, to convey attitudes, to present your personality, like your character, your temperament, your point of view, and that the fourth purpose is obviously to accompany and be a part of your verbal communication. But it's also important to remember that nonverbal communication is ambiguous, meaning sometimes it's not certain what you mean by a body language or a certain face that you make in a conversation. It's multi channeled. There's a lot of different things going on, like we talked about appearance, facial expressions, proxemics, how close or far you are to someone, your tone of voice, if you're loud, if you're quiet, all sorts of things. So it's multi channeled. That is continuous, even if you think you are just listening, that you're totally just the receiver of communication. You're always sending some kind of nonverbal message, even when your voice is quiet. And a lot of nonverbal communication is unintentional. And so it's important to keep these things in mind as well. And so some things to also at least acknowledge about nonverbal communication. You were upperclassmen, and not just that, but upper class communication arts majors. And so a lot of this should be a recap to you and should not be mind blowing to you. But it's just worth reminding you of these three major differences between verbal and nonverbal communication. And I would highlight more than anything else the first one of these on this list, that nonverbal communication tends to be perceived as more believable. That if there's any kind of conflict or discrepancy or lack of clarity between what you say and what you do, the person is almost always going to choose to believe your nonverbal communication over what you say verbally. We've all had situations with friends, family members, coworkers, where you might ask them, "Hey, how are you doing?" And they say, "I'm fine. I'm totally fine." And so their voice might sound angry, might sound depressed, might sound sad. Their body language, maybe they've got their hands in their pockets, maybe their arms are crossed, maybe their head is looking toward the ground, maybe they refuse to make eye contact with you, maybe they're especially loud, especially quiet. And so even though their verbal communication might have said, "I'm fine, I'm doing fine," that there might be absolutely nothing about their body language, facial expressions, or tone of voice that says that they're actually doing okay, that they're actually fine. And so that's an important thing to remember, especially moving forward, that your nonverbal communication is going to be what people really believe. So don't just consider what you say, but how you're saying things and how you're presenting yourself. Some other differences between verbal and nonverbal to mention. Nonverbal is multi-channeled. We've already talked a little bit about that. And nonverbal communication is continuous. If we compare that to the next slide, which is the similarities between verbal and nonverbal communication, you'll see obviously that there's a lot of overlap between these two things. Both verbal and nonverbal communication are symbolic, meaning they're open to interpretation. Um, what may look nervous to someone else might look excited to a different person. It's open to interpretation. In some cultures, eye contact is highly encouraged. In other cultures, it's not. Some cultures, both internationally and even on a local level, are very close. You probably have a friend or family member that considers themselves to be a huggy person or maybe a close talker. And those kind of situations really depend on the situation and how you choose to interpret them. At the same time, though, nonverbal communication and verbal communication are both rule guided, meaning there are certain expectations that come with both verbal and nonverbal communication. Sorry. For example, on page 22 of your book, it talks a little bit about communication rules, that there are both regulative rules that describe when, how, where, and with whom to talk about certain things. It's kind of the situation where both verbally and non-verbally, some things can change and be different on a certain situation. For example, your boss might call you, as your textbook suggests on page 22, at home after work hours, but it's probably not appropriate for you to call your boss at their home after work hours. And at the same time, what's appropriate perhaps to wear or to say to a person that's in authority of you, maybe at a workplace, might be different than how you might treat your best friend or your sibling. That there are certain rules that come with both verbal and nonverbal communication. And Page 22 in particular, like I said, talks a lot about that. Um, it also talks about some other kinds of rules uh, that prompt us to count certain kinds of communication and define them. So, for example, in your head, you probably have an idea of what counts as paying attention, what counts as showing affection, and what counts as being inappropriate in communication. So maybe um, interrupting someone, rolling your eyes, completely ignoring someone. Those are rules that we follow both in verbal and nonverbal communication. The fourth thing on this list, nonverbal communication may be intentional or unintentional. A lot of times I run into this as a professor. I'm in front of a class, at least when there's not a global pandemic, and I make eye contact with the whole class while I'm teaching, as you should. And sometimes people look bored out of their minds. And it's important for me to remember and for you to remember anytime you're speaking to an individual, a group, anytime you're involved in public speaking, that sometimes that nonverbal communication is very intentional. People are trying to express that they're uninterested, that they're bored, that you are not connecting with them. But a lot of times, it's important to remember that that is often very unintentional. And someone might have a certain posture or resting face or expression that they don't even know that they're doing that could affect your communication and how you feel like the message is being received. And so remember that it can be either intentional or unintentional. And ultimately, to remember as well, the fourth thing on this list, that nonverbal communication reflects your culture. Obviously, we've got a picture here of Post Malone. And so while Posty may be someone that you admire from your generation, someone that you think is a talented artist and totally an acceptable physical appearance, if we could talk about his face tattoos in particular. However, someone of a different generation might be less receptive to his physical appearance, which is a part of his nonverbal communication, because their perspective, their worldview, or their culture might be different. In the same way, um, depending on what context that you're in, certain attire, certain expressions are okay or not okay, depending on the culture that you're in. You may dress differently at work than you do at a sporting event, or maybe that you do differently than church. And those things are all segments of the culture that you're a part of, and your nonverbal communication is going to reflect that on a big scale as well as a part of a global scale. Now, chapter 3 talks a lot about listening. And again, if you are in this class, chances are you had interpersonal communication, which also had its own chapter about listening. As well, I know some of you may have had Mr. Bourne's listening and nonverbal communication class. So a lot of you may have had several courses that are primarily devoted to listening. But ironically, perhaps I wanted you to listen to me as I talk a few minutes about listening. And it's just worth pointing out, even though this is very basic textbook definition kind of stuff, that technically listening and hearing are two different things. That hearing is your physical ability to detect sounds, your ability for your eardrums to work correctly and sense things. Listening, at least as we talk about it in the world of communication and in this field, is an active, complex process that really requires you to think about what's being said, to pay attention, concentrate, and ultimately determine the message of the speaker, of the sender of the communication. And those are two different things. This is why, on an interpersonal level, in a small group setting, in a large group setting, at work, class, at church, even when you're watching um, videos, even when you're watching television. Sometimes you can be aware that people are talking, people are saying things, but you have no idea what they're saying, what they're actually trying to get across. And there are a lot of different reasons why that might happen. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you're hearing them, but you're not really listening. In other words, it takes a lot of work to really and truly listen, which is what chapter 3 is all about. And so I want to highlight a couple things from that chapter. The first one of these being 3 different types of listening that you may engage in doing from time to time. Again, obviously, this class and the textbook are focused on your career and careers in communication. However, just like there's a difference between hearing and listening, there are different types of listening. And then even in your professional career, you'll engage in each of these 3 types. But you'll notice that outside of a career, outside of your academic pursuits, you engage in these on a regular basis as well. The first one of these that your book mentions on page 50 is informational listening. This one is when you're focusing on the content of the message to acquire knowledge. You are trying to learn. And so in this case, you are, in theory, engaged in informational listening right now because this might be on your midterm. And so you are listening to my message and hope to learn this concept and demonstrate your knowledge of it later. In the same way, when you are in your career, regardless of where you end up working, part of being in a new position is listening to information during things like a new employee orientation session, maybe some one-on-one trainings, uh, committee meetings, that sort of thing. And so informational listening is something you're engaged in a lot because you want to understand, you want to do well, and you're just trying to soak in that information. Critical listening is another type of listening, but this is where you're kind of evaluating what is being said, that you're choosing to maybe accept or reject a message. You are thinking about maybe the advantages or disadvantages of a certain point of view. You are trying to determine really the pros and cons of the message. And so, anytime you've encountered someone who is engaged in sales, ultimately, what you're engaged in that scenario is critical listening. If someone is trying to get you to upgrade your cell phone plan, to get a better Wi-Fi connection, to get you to make your combo meal at a drive-through upsized to large or something like that, you're engaged in critical listening. What are the arguments for or against this? And then ultimately, you're deciding how you're going to fall in the decision. This will happen obviously a lot to you in your career as people are presenting different ideas, and then maybe as an individual or as a group, you decide how you want to move forward. And so, for example, years ago at the university, we were first introduced to the idea of not having in-seat classes on Friday. And some people were very much in favor of that because they gave us more time for extracurricular pursuits. Like for me, I advise the campus newspaper. And so that allows me to have Fridays off. So if someone needs to meet with me, they don't have to worry about what my class schedule is. I can help them with something like the newspaper on Fridays. That also gave people some more time off, maybe more time at home. And so people had arguments in favor of that. Other people were against the idea of not having in-seat class on Fridays, some of which those people were intimidated by trying to figure out how to add a Friday online component to their courses. Some of them were making the argument, and I think it's a good one, that online learning is just very different than in-seat learning, and so they didn't think they could accomplish as much on a Monday, Wednesday schedule as they could as a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule. But ultimately, as the faculty of the university, we were engaged in critical listening, trying to decide which options seemed best for us, and ultimately, it became the decision of each department. So some of us chose to move forward, like our department, without class in seat on Fridays, and other departments said it was essential for them to be effective educators and to really help students. They needed that Friday in seat session. So other departments continue to have class on Friday. But when we were trying to listen to the pros and cons of that situation as employees, we were engaged in critical listening, ultimately deciding how we were going to evaluate the message being sent. The third type of listening that your book talks about is empathic listening. This is listening when you're trying to understand the speaker's point of view, but without judgment. Often in empathic listening, you're listening to provide support, and in many cases, emotional support. In some situations, you might run into that, especially if you're in a leadership position. Maybe you'll have a employee that will come to you who's upset, they have a complaint, and you just need to listen to them without countering or criticizing or judging their point of view. You just want to really support them by hearing what they have to say. You will do this in customer service. You will do this in all sorts of areas in life. Hopefully you do this with your friends and family as well. When you're having a hard day, hopefully you've got people that will listen to you and let you just kind of talk it out. And hopefully you're there for the people you care about most, to just listen to them for emotional support. This will also happen as you deepen um, relationships and friendships with your coworkers. It is easy and often very therapeutic. If your coworker's having a bad day, they're frustrated at something they just experienced, whether that's working with a different coworker, a boss, a customer, something that happened to them maybe outside of a work situation, and they just need to talk to you about it. And that is not always a negative thing. Sometimes someone is having a wonderful day. They're getting married, they're having a baby, and they just need to tell you about it. But often when we think of empathic listening, um, we're going to help people um, by being there for them without expressing any judgment, and just really having empathy um, for them. And so that's empathic listening. And listening is hard. Your book goes at great lengths in chapter 3 to talk about some barriers to effective listening, some things that can make us just not as an effective listener, not as much of an active listener. It's easy to hear, it's hard to listen. I've already said that. The first barrier to listen that your book talks a little bit about is failing to limit distractions. This can happen both internally and externally. Sometimes you may need to control the external noise as much as you can around you. Um, so if you are um, in a noisy area, maybe you want to go maybe to a conference room where you can talk. If you are very distracted by your laptop in front of you or your phone in front of you, you may take steps to turn away from the computer, to put your phone away, and really focus on what's being said in a physical kind of way to eliminate those kind of distractions. Um, Controlling internal noise and internal distractions is difficult as well, but we need to do that as best we can, obviously. Sometimes that just means trying to take care of yourself as best you can. It's hard to listen when you're exhausted. It's hard to listen when you're really, really hungry. So making sure that you're getting enough rest, um, that you're eating right, that you're taking care of yourself, all the things that maybe your parents told you to do when you were a little kid, those things can actually help you be a better listener because you're not preoccupied about, oh, is it lunchtime yet? Or, oh, I didn't get any sleep last night. So controlling those kind of distractions as best you can is an important choice. But also um, trying to minimize some internal noise by ultimately choosing to focus on who or what is in front of you. It's easy to let your mind wander. It's easy to think about um, other things and other places and other people. It's easy to think about the weekend, etc., etc. But we need to try to become aware of those issues and address them to um, become a better listener. The second barrier to listening that it talks about is failing to focus on the message. There are a lot of reasons why we can get caught up in some different things other than what's actually being focused on by the speaker. It's easy to lose the main points and get sidetracked when you're listening. If the speaker uses a lot of technical language, a lot of jargon, if they're a business professor and you're in a general education, a gen ed business class, and they're talking about marginal cost accounting and gross domestic products, and throwing out all these accounting terms and economic terms, you might get lost in the jargon. Some of you may instead, um, especially in a classroom setting, but it's easy to do in your career as well, is deal with message overload. Message overload happens when a speaker includes too many details, making it difficult for the listener to comprehend. Sometimes presenters, even me, um, can end up making a mistake by including too much information in one single message. What's best is try to listen for the main points, knowing that not every word, every sentence, every story carries the same weight, that in the average lecture, average meeting, and so forth, there's probably a few main points that are really the takeaway. And so trying to listen to main points is the best way to deal with message overload. And we also need to limit our bias in order to be better listeners. It's easy to bring with you a certain attitude or judgment about a person, an issue, a topic, and it's easy to assume that you're going to disagree or be bored or whatever. And bias can happen in a lot of different ways. One way to reduce your bias is simply to acknowledge that it might exist and try to kind of bracket it out and remove it as best you can. At the same time, if you're sure of what you believe, what you think about a certain situation, and maybe you are biased against a certain point of view, well, if you're sure what you believe, what's the harm in really listening? And if you're not sure what you believe, then that's all the more reason to listen to someone, even if you have a bias against them. One of my core beliefs as a person is that everyone has a message worth listening to, and one of the biggest gifts we can give each other is the gift of listening. And so just kind of keeping that in mind helps me deal with some bias when I'm listening. The third barrier to listening that your book talks about is failing to be an active listener. And this is the most obvious of the three. But active listening isn't just listening, it's a certain way to listen. And I wish I could tell you some magic secret. and being involved and being an active listener. A lot of times it simply means simply internally making the choice to truly listen. And if you're in a situation where you're able to give verbal feedback to the speaker, sometimes paraphrasing it back to the sender, offering your own questions and reflections, a way to stay involved in that communication. There's a lot of other great things in chapter 3, but we will move on very quickly to talk just about a couple of things in chapter 5. Now, chapter 5 talks primarily about adapting to a new workplace and talks about the importance of diversity in the job setting. And so my hope is if you've made it this far in college, you've made it this far in this class, that you have a deep respect for diversity and that you are excited to face a workplace that will be surrounded, in which you will be surrounded by people that are in big ways and small ways different from you. Maybe that's age, maybe that's gender, maybe that's sexual orientation or religious belief or political belief or whatever. But my hope is that you are very open to diversity. So we're not going to really focus on breaking down all the different ways that you can be different than someone else, which chapter 5 actually does. But I want to talk a little bit about organizational culture. Now, your book defines organizational culture as the way an organization operates, the attitudes the employees have, and ultimately the overall tone and approach to any given business. Your book, um, for example, talks about Zappos, the website primarily known for selling shoes, though you can buy all sorts of things technically on Zappos, and talks about some things that are a part of Zappos organizational culture. It does that on page 101. Talking about some of their core values being adventurous, creative, and open minded. That people have open and honest relationships, that there's a positive attitude, a family spirit. People are encouraged to be creative, even a little weird, and to be both passionate about what you're doing, but also humble at the same time. Now, again, I've never worked at Zappos. I'm just going through the textbook example. But you can probably think about that as a workplace culture. And assuming that information is correct, it's probably easy for you to imagine workplaces that are similar to that and workplaces, maybe places you've worked before in high school or during your college career, that are very different from that. Some companies, big and small, that you work for may be very family oriented, where you feel like you're a part of a team, maybe even a part of a family, where your input is not just um, okay, but that it's welcomed, that it's encouraged. But there are plenty of other organizations that might be very different. I've had a lot of different jobs in my career. One of my jobs during graduate school, in addition to being a graduate teaching assistant, I worked as a cashier and waiter at Cracker Barrel. I also worked as I think my actual job title was certified photo specialist, but I developed photos and was a cashier at a Walgreens as well. And if you have ever been to both of those places of business, I don't think I have to tell you that even in my very small sample here, that working at Cracker Barrel is very different than working at Walgreens. That every place has its own culture. And I think it's important as you apply for internships and certainly apply for jobs after graduation, as you take one more step toward your career and your work life, to think about what is important to you as an organizational culture. What are the values of a place that you want to work? One of the reasons why I really enjoy teaching at UC is kind of this small atmosphere that everyone knows everybody. I came to this university because of my personal faith and the college's affiliation with that. And I also like the small town atmosphere that went along with with our campus. I have worked at other colleges, much bigger colleges, where the professor, maybe even by the end of the semester, hardly knew any of the students' names and was much more interested in doing research and publishing academic papers in scholarly journals than they were in teaching. And so, one of the things that I like as a professor at this university is we are primarily a teaching focused university, meaning that I can publish and do publish, but primarily I am encouraged to focus my time on teaching, on trying to help you get where you want to go and chase your dreams and get the knowledge that you need from my classes along the way to get there. I had a friend teaching at, again, another university, I don't want to mention the name, where she was actually told she was doing way too much community service and she needed to focus more on doing independent research. And that's not right or wrong. I can just tell you that's not my personal cup of tea, which is why I'm here and not there. So it's important to consider organizational culture. And your book talks a little bit about the assimilation process. And that's really the adjustment period and the quote unquote settling in that's common for anyone starting a new job. And that begins really at the job interview itself. Before you're even hired, you're going to go through an interview, whether that's an interview on Zoom or Skype, an in person interview, a telephone interview, where you'll get a sense of what the job is like, what the organizational culture is like before you're even hired. It might even affect the way the job posting was written, and certainly you may be able to tell a lot of things about the organization by the interviewer, whether that's your immediate supervisor or maybe someone working in human resources. I don't think I have to tell you, because a lot of you have worked other places before. Once you're hired, you step out of what your book calls the quote unquote fantasy world and into the reality of your new organizational culture. And like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, every organization, large or small, has its own culture. There are several things about our university, about UC, that are very different than other colleges, even very different than other colleges that are roughly our size in the state of Kentucky. And you can think about what those are, and maybe um, UC is very much like what you thought it would be based on the brochures and what the admissions counselor said and what you saw on social media. Or maybe it's very different to you. Just like you have an assimilation process when you come to UC as a freshman, and then you figure out what is this place really like. Obviously, you're going to do the same thing in your career. Um, One of the jobs I had for a summer in between years of college had a wonderful job interview at that place, but the fantasy world left on, let's say, day two of my part-time job at this national retail location. I don't want to tell you which one it was, but it was a very negative work culture. where the person that hired me was one of the nicest people I've ever met. But the people that were store managers, that were assistant managers, and even a lot of my coworkers, it was a very negative, very self-serving work environment. Where, no joke, I worked there about 12 weeks, and literally everyone who wasn't a manager had already quit by the time I quit on week 12 of that job. It was a very negative work culture. And so, while I don't hope you find that, it's just worth mentioning that every organization is going to have its own culture. At the same time, one of the best things about this job that I have now is the open door policy, not just between professors and students, but between my coworkers. That everyone, at least in my department, is willing to help each other. We have each other's back. We like to invest in each other's lives outside of teaching. And I love the people that I share a hallway with. I think we all have a very different point of view on a lot of different things, but it's a work culture that's an encouraging place to work, that's a fun place to work. And so, perhaps even more than my job interview, it was a very positive experience. So I don't want to scare anyone by sharing my negative example. I want to make sure and share positive examples too. And ultimately, as I continue what your textbook says about the assimilation process, obviously, as a new member of your culture, you will be both formally and informally taught some ways to think and behave as a part of that job. All sorts of ways to learn: overt questioning, indirect questioning, testing your limits, surveillance, and several other things that your book mentions on page 102. But it's also important to mention, while you will probably not change every organization from the ground up, that you are also an important contributor to the overall culture of the place that you work. And while you probably can't change it all overnight, it is valuable to think about the difference you can make about an environment and thinking about, is it a positive place? Is it an encouraging place? Is it a fun place to work? Those things may be dictated to you to some degree, but you also get to influence those things. And obviously, there's a huge part of the assimilation process that we could unpack and talk a little bit about, and a huge part of organizational culture as a whole. You know, that might include, what is the dress code for your workplace? Is it very formal? Is it very informal? Is there a casual Friday? Are you encouraged to kind of keep your head down and be quiet? Are you asked to share often? Is it a place um, that if you go by cubicles and offices, people have family photos and Funko Pops and artwork and things that express themselves? Or is it maybe a little bit more formal, a little less uh, playful or decorative? What's the furniture like? Um, but ultimately, when we talk about organizational culture in this process, we're mostly talking about what are the relationships and the communication like. But it's all important to consider. Last slide and last thing to talk about as I finish up highlighting just a few little things from chapter 5. It talks a lot about a variety of things that can make a workplace diverse, including not just um, age or dialect, race, but also things like the worldview of people. I think one of the things that is very shocking to a lot of students is your first kind of quote unquote real job, how different it can be from your everyday college career. Not that you are all the same as college students, but typically, if I have a room of 20 college students, a lot of you have the same interest, and certainly most all of you are the same age. And so when you go to a new workplace, the youngest person there might be significantly um, older than you. Youngest person next to you, I should say, might be significantly older than you. You might come from a background that is very conservative and face some people that have some different political or religious worldviews than you. Some people that might believe differently, and in this case, might have a different worldview than you. And I think ultimately, the challenge that comes with any workplace is the knowledge that it's going to be diverse and the opportunity you have to show what your book defines as mutual respect. Because, like it says here in the PowerPoint slide, when getting to know the diverse workplace, mutual respect, showing esteem for each other, choosing to understand each other, and showing that mutual respect. That's going to be the biggest thing I think that you can do to eliminate or at least lessen a lot of cultural tensions, misunderstandings, and conflict. And how do we manage mutual respect? How do we achieve mutual respect in the first place? I think all of us, um, hopefully, are quick to agree that mutual understanding is a beautiful thing. How do we get there? By doing those things that we've already talked about today. By being an active listener, by choosing to think about other people's perspective, and through training and through understanding, and ultimately through our verbal and nonverbal communication. That's how mutual respect. That's how mutual respect is really going to happen. And so, as we kind of come to a close today, I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk about some brief moments of chapters 2, 3, and 5 as you think about nonverbal communication, as you think about improving your listening skills, and as you think about it facing um, a new workplace. My hope is that these chapters and this brief lecture will help you think about some of these concepts. Hopefully that you can, hopefully so that you can apply them later on in your career and find the success and mutual respect that you're hoping for. With all that being said, I just want to say thanks again for listening,